Hello, everyone. How are you? I'm Chris Charbonneau, the Associate Publisher for PropTalk Magazine. Thanks for joining us today for another episode of PropTalk Live. It's 5 o'clock on Wednesday. We are going to be talking about the Thomas Point Lighthouse and the history of it with our co-founder of SpinSheet and PropTalk, Mr. Dave Gendell. It's going to be fascinating. We did a dry run of this yesterday, and it really is a really interesting topic. You learn a lot, not only about Thomas Point, but about just the Bay in general, some of the history behind it. And I'm not much of a history buff, but I really found this to be totally fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to it. And of course, thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I do want to thank Annapolis Yacht Sales. They are sponsoring this episode, and they've been a longtime sponsor of ours. If you're looking for a boat to go and gaze at the Thomas Point Lighthouse, go to Annapolis Yacht Sales. Check them out. Awesome. So let's see. We're still waiting on we've got a nice group of people joining us right now. Just as always, put your comments and questions in the comments section there, and we'll try and get to them during during all of this. I'll pipe in and interrupt whoever's talking and say, hey, we've got a good question for you. On top of that, always bear with us if we run into any technical difficulties. We'll try and remedy those really quick, but it looks like everything is running well right now. So I'm bringing in Kaylee. Kaylee is with us now. Hey.
Hello. How's it going?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. Oh, sorry. My coworker again.
The coworker. What's your coworker's name?
Daisy.
Daisy.
So if you see a cat tail moving around,
that's right. That's right. Well, if you're a dog bark, it's Max. So very good. Well, I'm just going to bring in Dave real quick since he doesn't need much of an introduction. Let's see. There he is.
Hello.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, guys. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm bringing up everyone's names just so we all know who we are. Awesome, Dave. Like I just said, I know we did a dry run of this yesterday, and I really found it to be pretty fascinating. And Dave's provided some great pictures for us that kind of go through his talk here. But I'm going to hand it over to Kaylee and go into the background here. But I hope you guys enjoy this. And again, if you have any questions, put them in the comments section, and we'll be sure to try and get those up. So thanks, guys. I'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, Dave. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. It's great to be here. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Been working pretty hard on it for the last year or so. So it's great to be here and support PropTalk and talk about one of my favorite Chesapeake Bay subjects.
Awesome. So Chris, sorry guys, my coworker here. So what Chris didn't mention before is that you have written a book about Thomas Point that is slated to come out later this year. So what inspired you to write this book, and kind of when did that all begin?
Yeah. Thanks again for the opportunity. And the book we'll talk about a bit as we go along here. It's off with the publisher right now. I grew up in Annapolis and first saw Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse with my family. Sailing, family cruising with my mom and dad and my brothers. And obviously it was an iconic thing on the Chesapeake Bay, but it really, in the last 20 or so years, I think we've really begun to realize, how accessible Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse is, how photogenic it is, how historic it is, and how it's actually still a working, aid to navigation. And the Thomas Point appreciation, the community has just gone through the roof in the last 20 or so years. I mean, it is a beloved icon. And, as most of my friends and folks I've known for a while would attest, I come from the sailing side of things. We grew up as sailors, and only recently have I been getting more involved in the fishing. So I found myself out at Thomas Point more and more often. in the last few years, attempting to fish out there. And as I was going along, I wanted to learn more about it and dug in a bit and did some searching. And, Thomas Point Lighthouse is featured in a number of books. There's a lot of lighthouse compendiums that feature it, Chesapeake Bay history books, but there was no dedicated book to Thomas Point Lighthouse specifically. So I dug in a little bit, and clearly, if you have one lighthouse that's been existing on the same bit of Chesapeake Bay since 1875, there's some amazing history there, and some stories that are untold, some stories that are a little bit under the radar that really knocked my socks off. So I dug in a bit to the topic and kind of fell in love with the history of the lighthouse. So we all love the aesthetics of it and what it stands for, but the history to me was fascinating. It's the rise of Baltimore, and it's the rise of Chesapeake Bay shipping, and the rise of technology out there on the point in the late 19th century. So I queried one publisher. I'd actually bought a couple lighthouse books off Amazon to check them out, and far away lighthouses, and they came, and I looked through them, and one was great, and I queried the publisher and said, hey, I would love to do a book on Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse, and here's why. And the first and only publisher I queried accepted it and said, write the thing. So I've spent probably the last 9 months working pretty hard on a Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse book, which is in production now.
Awesome. Well, that's very exciting. So before we really dive into some of the history of Thomas Point, you mentioned before that there are several common misconceptions about the lighthouse.
Yeah, I love urban legends and local oral history as much as anyone. And, anyone that spent time with me on a boat know that I'll always hit on a few legends and, myths and things like that. But there's a couple of things about Thomas Point that I learned along the way that kind of blew a couple of these common perceptions out of the water a bit. There are people in Annapolis, and I met one yesterday, believe it or not, who still remember. They say, I remember as a little kid walking out there to that lighthouse, or driving out there to that lighthouse through the cornfields. As a little girl. Someone told me, and the lighthouse that we know out there on the end of Thomas Point Shoal, 1875 screw pile, was never attached to the land. It was always out there on the end of a shoal. So you may read occasionally or talk to folks that say they remember walking or driving out there to the lighthouse. That was never attached to the land. So that's one that we dug out, and we can talk about that in a few minutes when we talk about what was originally on the point. The other one that really jumped out at me is, we as a boating community and as Annapolitans really connect Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse with Annapolis. It's a symbol of Annapolis, and you see it all over town, and it's actually owned by the city of Annapolis. The structure itself is owned by the city since 2004. But the reality is, as I dug in, this is a story of Baltimore. Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse was built because it was Baltimore commerce that was being interrupted by that shoal. It was Baltimore shipping industry that wanted Thomas Point to be in place, and it was actually built in sections in Baltimore and delivered down. So it was near Annapolis, just 5 miles away, but it's really a Baltimore story through and through, just until this most recent chapter when the city of Annapolis took it over. So that's a couple things I've unearthed that I think are kind of an interesting twist.
Yeah, definitely. And here we have a nice picture there, the bottom right.
Yeah, that's on one of my fishing sorties. So, I'm still a better photographer than I am a fisherman, and I'm not too proud to admit it. So when things are going bad with the fishing, I'll end up taking the iPhone out and getting some shots. And this was at sunset a couple of years ago.
Nice. So the Thomas Point, excuse me, that we see today, so that was not the original lighthouse that was actually placed in that area. Could you tell us about some of the earlier towers? Yeah,
I sure will. So, as I mentioned, Baltimore really began to thrive in the late 18th century, right after the Revolutionary War. Baltimore quickly surpassed Annapolis in importance as a shipping port, and getting ships safely in and out of Baltimore was super important to the whole United States economy. I mean, for many decades in the 19th century, Baltimore was the second largest city in the United States. It was a massive port, bringing material out from Pennsylvania, Western Maryland, West Virginia, and down through the Jones Falls and through other ways into Baltimore, where there was moving water that could grind grain and turn it into flour, loading it on ships. Imports coming in from South America and from Europe, and the port was absolutely thriving. Even as early as the 1810s, 1820s, it had blown by Annapolis, and Baltimore was it. The twist is, Baltimore's over 100 miles from the open Atlantic, and you need to get the ships up and down the Chesapeake Bay safely. And if a ship runs aground on the bay, it's not the end of the world. It's soft bottom typically. It's not going to break up like it would on rocks or on a coral head typically. But still, a grounding, it delays the schedule. It puts the ship and the crew at some degree of risk. It's an embarrassment. It's an inconvenience, and it costs money. So getting a light on the shoal at Thomas Point was important, from the very beginning of the Port of Baltimore. The shoal extends 1.5 miles out into the bay. It's pretty far, distant there before you get to deep water. So mariners had begun to complain, saying like, hey, we're running aground on Thomas Point at an alarming rate. And in the early 1820s, they actually asked for a light on the end of the shoal to mark it. They didn't get that. Instead, they got a 30-foot high stone tower that was actually built on the point itself. So down there in the vicinity of the Thomas Point Park, which you can visit today, a stone tower similar to this one was built. So a couple caveats. This was built in 1825. It's a 30-foot high stone tower, built of stone that was quarried up on the lower Susquehanna River in the Havre de Grace, Maryland area. This is not the tower that was at Thomas Point. This is a different tower that was depicted in a magazine in the 19th century. But this is the built by the same builder, and it's the same design roughly as what stood at Thomas Point. The problem with that tower was it was 1.5 miles from the deep water, and it was only 30 feet high. So the light was getting disrupted by the trees. The mariners had problems seeing the light. The tower itself was very poorly constructed. It almost immediately was at risk from erosion. Water came in through the seams. So this tower was taken down and rebuilt a couple feet higher in a little bit of a safer location. And it lived there all the way through the Civil War. It was not a good aid to navigation. The complaints from mariners constantly through the 19th century. Thomas Point Shoal is a threat. The light you have there is awful. What we need is a light out on the end of the point. So these towers, manned by locals, largely ineffective, were there, but Baltimore was thriving. The shipping was rolling through, and they couldn't see this light on shore. So we needed something out on the end of the point.
Gotcha.
So here's a depiction. Thanks, Chris, for forwarding this one. I've gone ahead here and using some historic charts, drawn in what the shoal looked like at the time of that shore tower. And you can see I've also drawn in a little yellow sun, which is almost exactly in the location of those original 30-foot towers. And on the current chart, just on the right side of the channel in and out of Fishing Creek there are still some hard bottom there, and still some obstructions there that you can find if you venture out of the channel. So that's roughly where the old tower was, in relevance to the current lighthouse out on the end of the shoal.
Great. So then what year was the current Thomas Point Lighthouse built?
Yeah. So, Chris, if you advance to the next one, there we go. Perfect. And you can make that take over if you want, because I think it's such an interesting slide. So, during the mid 19th century, technology developed in Europe that we now know as the screw pile lighthouse. This started in England and in Ireland, and quickly became popular over there. And the idea was you could build a lighthouse out over the shoal on the water, right? You would screw cast iron screws into the bottom. That would make a foundation, put a platform on top of that, build a cottage on top of that, and put the light on top of the whole thing. This was relatively inexpensive. This was definitely a fast way to build a lighthouse, and it became very, very popular. So after the Civil War, when we were getting back on our feet here in the United States, the U.S. government got very serious about their lighthouses. This screw pile technology, combined with the new Fresnel Lens technology, which enabled a much brighter, cleaner light, began to see its way onto the Chesapeake Bay. And a strategy was developed that would put a number of these screw pile lighthouses up and down the bay and mark the route. So suddenly we had new technology that gave us an efficient, relatively inexpensive way to light the channel out on the end of the shoals, which is where we needed them, not among the trees on shore. So a screw pile was proposed for Thomas Point, and the plans went out, and dozens of these screw piles were built up and down the bay. They were built in kit form. So if you look up on the top one there, you see that A9. It's a fascinating story. That's actually a photo from on board the lighthouse right now. John Potvin, who looks after the preservation efforts that are happening today, took that photo with some of the other volunteers out there. So these kits were assembled on Baltimore Harbor at Lazaretto Point in the harbor there. And the Lighthouse Board prefabricated as many of these sections as they could, published kit plans, and then went out onto the point to put it together, or out to the location to put it together. So some of these kit markings are still visible on the structure out there. And this is a great shot that John took that's actually in the book. The plans on the left that you see, those are somewhat widely circulated. I did see a question go by about research. I got these out of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. But again, they're widely circulated. It's not like these are these are difficult to find. But I did do a fair amount of research on this. Multiple trips to the National Archives in College Park, and a couple trips to the National Archives in DC to pull out as much historic material as I could. So just to finish on our Thomas Point screw pile, another twist to the story is as they were planning this screw pile out on Thomas Point, the winter before it was built, a number of screw piles on the bay began to have damage from ice flows. Those screws underneath were very vulnerable. That metal structure underneath were very vulnerable to flowing ice. And the Lighthouse Board had a little bit of a moment of panic and said, we're about to put a screw pile out in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, completely exposed. It's the wrong design for the spot. We can't do it. And they asked to change the plans and go for a sturdier lighthouse. So we may have seen a lighthouse like the caisson we see at Sandy Point or the caisson we see at Bloody Point on Thomas Point. And if the Lighthouse Board had had its way, we would have. But the funding to build those more expensive lighthouses was denied. So instead, they bulked up the Thomas Point design and stuck a screw pile out there. So do we find it ironic that the longest, oldest screw pile still in its place on the Chesapeake Bay was the most exposed screw pile and was the screw pile that was probably not even supposed to be there? Like, I find that wonderful. They put it out there. So, Chris, can you go back to the capstan photo or image? So I do get a lot of questions on how it was built, and this was a fascinating one for me. So, the screws, the cast iron screws, the blades themselves on Thomas Point are about 30 inches wide, right? So almost a full yard wide. They're driven 11.5 feet into the bottom of the bay. So you can imagine you have to generate a fair amount of force to push that down there. Unbelievably, almost 150 years later, all 9 of those are in place. All 9 of those have been deemed rock solid, engineering wise, still solid. Other parts of the lighthouse have had to be renovated and preserved and swapped out, but those are still in there. How did they drive them out in the middle of the bay 11 and a half feet deep, these big cast iron piles, 9 of them. So we don't know exactly how the Thomas Point ones were driven. There's no record of it in the kit that I haven't been able to find any instructions at the archives or elsewhere, but we have a couple hypotheses. So this is a drawing of an early screw pile that was put together in Europe. And here they brought a gang of folks out on a barge and set a capstan situation up and had them walk in circles and drive it using a capstan. So this is possible. This may have happened at Thomas Point. I've also heard some local, again, some lore that says that they brought oxen out there and livestock and hooked them up to a capstan and sent them around in circles. So there's another possibility. I believe since they were building these at scale, dozens of them up and down the bay, and since Thomas Point was so close to Annapolis and to their home base in Baltimore, I believe that there was probably a steam-driven capstan that drove these in here that they were able to bring out. We do know that at Thomas Point, they drove the center piling first, 11 and a half feet down, and then they used jigs or templates that they put over it to make sure that the other 8 pilings were all in place properly. So you had to get that center one right, and then you had to build the outlying parts correctly for the cottage to fit on there properly. So I love that little. I'm the son of a civil engineer, so if you can ever get into the engineering of history, I'm buying it. I'm in.
Okay. So let's see. We had a question about lighthouse keepers. So you're mentioning that there's a pretty interesting story about Thomas Point's first keeper. Yeah.
So, and Molly, thank you for that question. So I'll answer Molly's question directly. The last keeper left Thomas Point in 1986. So in September 1986, Thomas Point was automated by the U.S. Coast Guard. By that point, they knew they were going to save Thomas Point, right? A lot of lighthouses, similar screw piles were burned. A lot of them were dismantled, taken down. Thomas Point by that point was going to be saved. So it was automated in 1986 and has been automated ever since then. It's still a very hands-on operation. It was hands-on with Coast Guardsmen up through 2004 when a public-private partnership took over, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. The first keeper, which you mentioned, of the Shoal Lighthouse, I love this story, and this is kind of at the heart of the book that I've written, just because it brings so much personality to it. So they've got this new high-profile screw pile out there on the point. It's 1875. The Port of Baltimore is thriving. You've got a screw pile lighthouse 5 miles away from the Naval Academy, 5 miles away from the capital of Maryland. It's a high-profile assignment. It's the most advanced screw pile that they had built to that point, et cetera. So to man the new lighthouse, they turned to a wounded Civil War veteran. And I did some research on this gentleman. His name is Eugene Birchanall, and he grew up on the Eastern Shore and had some experience as a lighthouse keeper. But before that, he was actually wounded at Antietam. He was fighting for the 1st Delaware Brigade at Antietam, was shot a few times on the Bloody Lane at Antietam, pretty sacred spot. And in his early 20s, he was somewhat incapacitated by those wounds. I've talked to Sandy Clunies, who's the historian with the U.S. Lighthouse Society and is an expert on this, and she tells me that it was something of a reward, for Civil War soldiers who had fought bravely and proven their loyalty to the United States to be given a lighthouse keeper assignment. It was a great honor, and it was sort of recognition of their service. And so Eugene Birchanall, wounded at Antietam, was named the first keeper of Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse. And the thought would be it'd be easier to manage yourself out there on a short little screw pile than it would be to walk the stairs to the top at Hatteras or at Cape Henry or one of the taller towers. So he was a keeper for a couple of years, had a lot of adventures out there, and I dug into his biography, and it's featured pretty prominently in the book. He's actually, he died and is buried in Annapolis, right at the St. Anne's Cemetery on College Creek. So when you're driving into town on Rao Boulevard, and you see the cemetery on your right there. The first keeper of Thomas Point Lighthouse is buried there. And the nice little twist on the Birchanall story is on his grave headstone says "All is well." That's his epitaph on there. So I thought that was kind of slick. A great ending to his story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned a couple other stories from keepers. One keeper that maybe mysteriously disappeared.
Yeah. So, we still we call it clickbait now, right? But back in the early 20th century newspaper headlines, if you saw a hot newspaper headline in Baltimore, you would pick it up. So in 1903, there was a keeper who was from Baltimore. He was actually an assistant keeper, and he was on the lighthouse alone one afternoon. The head keeper had gone into Annapolis to do some shopping and take a little bit of a break, and that was not unusual. You would have a keeper alone on there during the day, and he had been having some trouble. He had been. We don't know the exact nature of it, but we know that he was despondent, and his mood was generally described as despondent and sad and troubled. And sure enough, the head keeper, as he approached on the boat during the day, saw that the light was on, which was very odd because they extinguished the light at sunrise and put a cover over the Fresnel Lens to keep the sun off of it. So knew something was odd. So he came on there and found no sign of the assistant keeper. He had completely disappeared. No note, no nothing. His clothes were folded up, and he was gone. So this led to some great speculation in Baltimore newspapers. Keeper dies of loneliness was one of the headlines, and a lot of hypotheses about what happened to him. Did he swim to a passing ship and beg to be taken aboard? Did he swim ashore? The other boats were still in place, so he didn't take a boat. The widely accepted hypothesis after a brief investigation was he was despondent, and he jumped off the rail and drowned. But he disappeared. So I've never heard any ghost stories from the lighthouse. I'm sure that there are some floating around out there. But if there was a ghost story, Henry Attucks, the young keeper who mysteriously disappeared in 1903, would probably be one. So he's a chapter in the book as well.
Wow. Yeah, that does sound really interesting. So you've also talked a little bit about the lens. So I understand that the current lens at the lighthouse is not the original.
That's correct. And I think we have an illustration of that. There we go. Nice. You can make that. Yeah, there we go. So what we have here is on the left is a Fresnel lens. And these were incredible pieces of technology. And I love technology as much as I love history. So when I learned about how the screw pile technology was employed here on the Chesapeake Bay and quickly rolled out, that fascinated me. It concurred with the development of this Fresnel lens here on the left, developed in France in the mid-19th century. It enabled a very bright, very clear light to be shown. So to be clear, this is not the source of the light. This is a lens that's put over the source of the light, and it accentuates it, expands it, extends it. So Fresnel lens made of this very heavy cut glass, cut into prisms. This is the one that was put into Thomas Point in 1899. This is the Fresnel lens that served at Thomas Point through 1986. So when the Coast Guard came to automate the lighthouse, this lens was not only historic, been there since 1899, they're also valuable. The original Fresnel lenses that came into the United States were considered national treasures. The big ones, like at Hatteras, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in the 19th century, even $1 million, and were guarded and protected very, very carefully. So this Fresnel lens was at Thomas Point. It's a little smaller than the Hatteras one, obviously. It was sent to Baltimore in 1986, and it is now at the Coast Guard Yard at Curtis Bay. So it's in safekeeping up there at Curtis Bay. Would the likes of John Potvin and Alice Estrada at the Annapolis Maritime Museum, love to see this on display in Annapolis somewhere? I certainly would, and I know that those folks would. But at the moment, it's a Coast Guard office up in Curtis Bay. So what you see on the right is the current lens that's out there at Thomas Point. So that's an acrylic lens, which is a fancy way of saying plastic, which sits over a light. If you look at the current chart of Thomas Point, it says that the light is visible for 11 miles, right? The notation on the current chart. Maybe with a properly maintained Fresnel lens, showing the light is visible for 11 miles. But as somebody that's out there a fair amount at night, I will tell you the current light is not visible for 11 miles. The current light is powered by solar electricity. So there are some solar panels out on top of the lighthouse, connect to a battery bank, which power this light, and it shines every night, right? It's volunteers from the United States Lighthouse Society, the Chesapeake chapter of the United States Lighthouse Society, the Annapolis Maritime Museum, and other volunteers are out there constantly looking after the cottage. The light itself is still maintained by the Coast Guard. So, technically the Coast Guard runs the navigational part of the lighthouse. NOAA runs the weather station that's on the lighthouse, and the society and the museum run the tours and the preservation of the lighthouse.
You said one of the misconceptions about Thomas Point is that people think that they hear the foghorn from Thomas Point, but that's actually not the case these days.
Yeah, this is the saddest part whenever I give these talks, and at Fawcett's, I think I popped a few bubbles last year when I said this. So, the image of it being a foggy or a stormy day, and we're at home in Annapolis, and we can hear the resonating foghorns out there, is a romantic one, and it's a great one. And we do hear foghorns out there, right? We do. Like I live out near Tolly Point, and on a foggy morning, I can hear the foghorns going. And the reality is that that's not the Thomas Point foghorn. So the Thomas Point foghorn has actually been turned off for the last couple of years. It drew a lot of battery. And if you think about it, if it's foggy enough that you need the foghorn and the light, you're not collecting any solar energy at that point. And, after a day or so of that, the batteries wear out. So the light more important than the foghorn. So the foghorn has been unplugged. So it does still say on the current chart that there is a foghorn or a horn. Mm-hmm. That's not true. So what you do hear are the ships that are anchored out there in the anchorage off Annapolis, blowing their foghorns, and that's what we hear from shore. That chart right there, Chris, is a great one. This is an 1895 chart. This is after the lighthouse was built. It had been in place for 20 years. It still shows the peninsula well intact, which has since opened up and largely disappeared. But I thought this was, I have a lot of charts of Thomas Point, but this was one of my favorites. Can you, Chris, go, and I keep saying Chris because he's managing the images. Can you go back to the 1885 image number 6? You had it up there for a second. Yeah. So this thing is this is believed to be the first photo of Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse, and this is the first one that turns up at the National Archives. So there's nothing preceding this available at the National Archives, and I've looked in DC and in College Park. So this is looking northwest. On the left side there, about halfway up, you can see a little blur of Tolly Point, of the Bay Ridge of the Bay Ridge Resort at this point in 1885. So you see a little blur of Tolly Point. Another great reference down low is on the right side, about a third of the way up. You can see an icebreaker that had been installed on the north side to break up some of the ice flows that were damaging the screws themselves. That icebreaker is still in place, right? And Kaylee or Lenny Rudow or Tom Weaver or Fisherman might lead you to throw a few casts towards that because there's some good structure there. That icebreaker is actually tied back in with the 7 core screws, so it's all part of one structure. So underwater, there are beams that connect that. So don't try to cut across that. It's not a shortcut. But this is a so this is a great shot. Earliest one, you can see there's two lighthouse board. We presume they're keepers there on the left side. We can see there one of their longboats is hauled up there. There is a bell there. This was automated even then. The fog bell, they had an automated system. They would wind up that would ring it when it was foggy. Just a striking black and white photo of the lighthouse and pre-riprap, right? So we would notice that today there's big piles of stones and riprap all around that base to protect it against ice. Kaylee, not to provide structure for fish, protect it against ice, because I know what you're thinking, because I know you. You like the fishing, but it's protected against ice, right? So that's before that was put in. Down there at the base, and I like this so much. This is actually the back cover of the book.
Very nice. Well, you've been mentioning a lot about fishing, and I understand that you did talk to a couple of our friends, Lenny Rudo and Tom Weaver. So why is it that Thomas Point is such a fishing hotspot?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was oystering on Thomas Point for 100+ years, right? So Thomas Point oysters were actually a popular name to have on your can of oysters in Baltimore or in New York City during the oyster craze. And there was a lot of oystering activity on the shoal. The Oyster Navy, which was active in the 1870s and 1880s, in the early days of the screw pile out there, was kind of peaking right as Thomas Point was first manned. And Eugene Birchanall witnessed firsthand a lot of activity on that shoal. There were actually some good Oyster Navy oystermen interactions on the shoal, and I have the story in the book of two oystermen from Baltimore that were actually shot and killed by the Oyster Navy out there on the bay. So oysters were prevalent. The keepers would be, in the oystering months, the keepers would be kept company constantly by dredgers and tongers out in the vicinity of there. I've got a little section in the book where I talk about in the early 1900s, the tongers were getting extremely close to and even underneath the cottage and tonging for oysters, and the keeper had got into some arguments, shouting back and forth with them, and ended up having to write to DC, about it. As the oysters have faded away as a commercial harvest in large part, it's now a fishing spot, and it's a big fishing spot. Anyone that's been out there, especially in striper season, knows it's jammed with fishing boats, both charter boats and private boats. And it's been a fishing spot for a long time. I interviewed Lenny from Fish Talk, and Lenny talks about going there as a kid and fishing for flounder on the point, and during the moratorium on rockfish, it was a big flounder spot. It's a hot rockfish spot these days. Tom Weaver has taken me out there and talked me through it, and I talked with Lenny a bit. Thomas Point's got a lot going for it as a fishing spot. It's got structure, right? There's underwater structure there that little critters grow on and feed an ecosystem that eventually becomes attractive to rockfish. It's got current. There's a lot of moving water out there. The water moves around the end of the point, so it's constantly moving. It's got a nice blend of flood tide bringing up salt water from the ocean twice a day. So it's got a lot going for it, and it is a red hot striper place, like so hot that on an evening in September, I wouldn't even get near it, for fear of getting too close to someone, because there'd be a dozen boats there or more. So Lenny and Tom were kind enough to give this, novice fisherman a lot of input. And I actually have a section in the book where Tom Weaver and Lenny both give a lot of feedback on fishing and at Thomas Point, and I'm thankful for that.
Awesome. Well, I know, like you said, just a lot of fishermen can bring their boats pretty close up to the lighthouse. But if someone wanted to actually tour the lighthouse, is that a possibility? Yeah. And I know things are probably on hold now, but
yeah, great point. So I would strongly tell you to not go onto the rocks or the boarding platform. There are cameras out there. There was a vandalism situation out there in 2016 where someone did go aboard and did some damage. So I would tell you that the people that own and run the lighthouse and the local law enforcement authorities are extremely serious about that, especially in the wake of the vandalism incident. So don't go on it on your own. Stay away from it, as tempting as it may be. I'll tell you, it's a pretty big padlock as soon as you get on there. So, you're not going to see anything anyway. But if you do want to visit it officially and you do want to support the preservation efforts, which we'll get a little more into the preservation efforts in a moment, there are tours out there. The Annapolis Maritime Museum organizes the official tours out there. There's a crew of docents who are experts on the lighthouse, who know the history and the structure and the preservation forwards and backwards, and they can take you through it, and you can get your photos and you can learn about it and support it. I highly recommend doing one of those official tours. Another way to be part of the lighthouse is through the preservation efforts. So there's constantly work being done on the lighthouse. There's woodworking clubs that go out there and work on the wood in the lighthouse. There's a huge crew of volunteers through the U.S. Lighthouse Society, the Chesapeake chapter of that society, the Maritime Museum, that are out there doing work all the time. It's cleaning, it's painting, it's historical research. They've done a remarkable job on the interior, bringing it up to historical specs in different manners. So there's opportunities to get involved that way as well. So if you love that lighthouse and want to actually get out there and be part of it, physically be on it, which is a pretty moving experience, especially once you understand the history of it a bit. There's opportunities for you to get out there, either as a guest or as a volunteer, and it's even cooler than you would think if you get an opportunity to do it.
Yeah, and I think you actually had a photo of inside the lighthouse, I believe. There we go. Yeah,
so this is so one of the things that the preservation groups have done over the years. Henry Gonzalez of the Lighthouse Society, originally, followed up by just a massive crew of people, Bob Stevenson, John Potvin, among the more recent, dozens of folks involved in this, Howard and Kathy Lewis out there all the time. Is it that they've kind of themed some of the rooms on the main structure? So one of the sections on the main structure is made to look like how it did when it opened, right? So they've got period furniture in there, they've got period artifacts in there. This particular room is made to look like what it looked like in the Coast Guard era. So in 1986, when the Coast Guard automated it, this is what it looked like. This was a former bedroom on the main layer, the main level, which was turned into a Coast Guard office. So they had photographs of the lighthouse during its last Coast Guard years, and they redid this room to look like the Coast Guard office that was there. They matched it as closely as possible to the photographs. So in 1986, when the last keeper made the last log entry, it was on this desk, in the same configuration. I'll point out a couple interesting things in this photo. There's two clocks, because the Coast Guard liked their reports to be in Greenwich Mean Time and in local time. So they put them up there to help the keepers do that immediately. There's a Sharp television there, Sharp being the brand, which one of the volunteers, Kathy Lewis, who's been incredible, went out and found the exact same Sharp television that was featured in the 1986 photographs and installed it there in the same spot. So you've got the same TV. So I can picture the keepers, in the 80s out there, listening to the Orioles, watching the Orioles on Channel 13, in the 70s and 80s, on that television. I know they also had, in the later Coast Guard days, a video game system out there. So they played some Atari out there. There was a great rack of books out there, all sorts of books. And Henry Gonzalez, one of the Lighthouse Society folks, has a photo of the library and actually has gone out on eBay and bought the exact books that were there in 1986. And so that rack of books is there. That's the kind of attention to detail that the Lighthouse aficionados have put into this, and it's it's pretty remarkable. And it's that love lighthouse. It warms my heart to see these folks putting their talent and energy that direction.
Yeah, it is just incredible. Like you said, how many people really put so much effort into, maintaining this such an iconic lighthouse. So Dave, I mean, we can't thank you enough for sharing so much information. If we could circle back to your book, because I know plenty of people are going to be excited to delve even more into this history. When could we expect to see that out on the streets?
Yeah, so I wrote the book. The book's finished. It has about 50 photographs in it. A lot of the historic photos that we've seen here are in it, and the plans, and some of the original charts, etc. It is a history of the point and of the shoal, and then of the lighthouse. There's profiles of a few of the keepers. There's a fishing section, and there's a big section on the current preservation effort and what's being done out there now to preserve the lighthouse. And I will note here that I am going to give a portion of the proceeds that I earn to lighthouse preservation efforts. It's just too important to let go. So, so I'm heavily supportive and engaged with that group, and want to do all I can to do it. So when's the book coming out? Yesterday, I signed off on the galley pages. So the actual final proofs of the pages, had to initial them and send it off, which is always a little. You're a magazine editor, you know how this goes when you send something off to be printed. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit of a standing on the edge of a cliff kind of a feeling. So sign that off. I also got the bad news though, that because of this COVID pandemic, the publication date has been delayed. It was originally going to come out at the end of July. We don't know exactly when it's going to come out. It's on a little bit of a pause for COVID, but it will come out as a print paperback. It will be a digital iBooks version that you could get on your Kindle and on your iPad, and then we're also going to do an audio book version of it. So we'll have an audio book version of it as well. The publisher I'm working with is down in Charleston, South Carolina, and they've got a lot of experience releasing these things. So I would imagine that whenever it comes out, hopefully not too long after July, we'll have some events. We'll have some celebrations. We'll raise some money for the preservation of the lighthouse. We'll get the book and the history of it distributed out there, and as anybody that ever writes or works on these sort of projects, that is a fun thing to think about out there on the horizon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We just had a question come in. The name of your book?
So the name of the book, I was at the table when we named SpinSheet, right? And I was at the table when we named PropTalk, and we'll never, Mary and I have an agreement that we'll never say exactly who had it come out of their mouth first. But I was at the table. So even with those two names, which are kind of invented words, I've always liked the name it what it is philosophy, call it what it is. So this book's called Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse. That's the name of it. And Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse with a Chesapeake Bay icon is the subhead. And it will soon begin to appear for pre-order. And I'm hoping that you guys at PropTalk and SpinSheet will help me publicize that when it comes out for pre-order. Yeah.
So all you guys watching, stay tuned. You'll be the first to know when his book hits the streets.
That's awesome. Look, I'm still a PropTalk. I got my credibility right here.
Okay, I might have to break out my old.
Oh, come on.
Oh, I had it closed. Too tight. There we go.
Nice. I like it. So there we go. So
got it all going on. Dave, just real quick, somebody did ask, and I think you did mention it, but where is the original light crystal right now?
Yeah, so the original, Cheryl, hey, thanks for watching. The original light, I had to do a little research on this because I didn't really get this myself. There was a light source, like the equivalent of a bulb, right? And that wasn't anything special. That was just a bulb that was in there, fed by lamp oil, originally, later by electricity. The lens that went over that is what, that's where the magic happened. That's the Fresnel lens that they fitted over top of that bulb. There were actually a couple different bulbs in there. It was, in case one went out, another one would be able to come into service. But that Fresnel lens is where the value was, and that was where the history was. And that is at the Coast Guard Yard in Curtis Bay, which so it's not visible out there to the public. It's in a spot up there behind the gate at Curtis Bay. The room itself that the Fresnel lens was in, that little room you can see up on top with the partially red, that's called the lantern room. And that's actually a design as well that will help, expand out the beam and make the Fresnel bigger. You can see it in the background there, that red sector and the clear sector. So you can see all three here. You can see the light source inside. You can see the acrylic lens that's over top of it. And then you can see the lantern room itself. So at the end of the day, the keepers in the Fresnel era would cover it. They had a very soft cloth covering they would put over it to protect it from dust and to protect it from anything possibly that could impact the lens. And then they actually had curtains they would draw in the lantern room to keep the sun out of it. So to keep the sun off of it. So it was a treasure. That was the that was the main one. So Cheryl, the Fresnel lens is in Curtis Bay. The actual light source that was inside of the Fresnel lens was somewhat of a disposable light source. All right. So let me hijack for a second here, Kaylee, and just, I do want to remind everyone that's watching and, thank you all for doing this. I do realize that being in the print magazine business in 2020, having a global pandemic sweep in and make distributing the print magazines, difficult, and your distribution partners are closed, and gradually reopening. I do want to say, you guys have done an amazing job keeping the community engaged electronically. And I know the issues of the magazines are up there in PDF form or flip through form that people can go and get their fix of Chesapeake Bay boating and support the advertisers that have stuck with you through this pandemic. We did SpinSheet 25 years ago, and then we did PropTalk starting in 2004, almost 15 years ago, and or 15 plus years ago, and the resiliency of the way you all have handled yourself in this pandemic has been amazing. And kudos to the team, but also kudos to the advertisers who support you and everybody that's watching that supports Chesapeake Bay boating and values, this community. You have to go out there and support the local advertisers in these magazines. Just think about that marine industry that we treasure here on the Chesapeake Bay and what brings them together. And I know that I'm extremely happy to go spend money for our boats and in the SpinSheet PropTalk Fish Talk advertisers. And please think about that when you're out there fitting out your boat. You can order zincs off internet retailer, but buying them from a local spot feeds back into this great community.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. I could not have said that better myself. And we really cannot thank you enough for, spending the evening with us tonight. And we can't wait for your book to come out.
Thank you. I love the opportunity. I'm looking outside right now and wondering if it's a sailing night or a fishing night. It's suddenly very pretty here. And it's nice to have that option out there on the Thomas Point in the Severn River.
Absolutely. Well, again, Dave, thanks very much. Kaylee, thank you very much. I think I love this. This was a lot of fun. It's always interesting when you just don't even expect some of the things that you talked about. I'm the son of an engineer as well, and just thinking about what it took to build that thing, to drive the screw pile in, it just fascinates me. I still don't believe that that's actually how it was done, but hey, it's still around,
and that it's still there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a magical thing. Like even in 1875, they said don't build it. It's not the right design for the spot, and they had to build it anyway. It was so desperately needed, and the fact that it's still there, it has a little magic to it. I think. I think there's a little magic to it. Something special out there. And then in the last 20 years. it's been the volunteers, right, and the corporate sponsors that have been out there, the Lighthouse Society and the museum. I mean, they're out there constantly battling, age and weather, et cetera. So, there's some magic, but there's also a lot of blood and sweat out there.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Kaylee. This was great. Another great Prop Talk Live is in the book. But especially thank you for everyone who tuned in. We had a great crowd tonight, and we appreciate your time, and appreciate you guys wearing your visors with me.
Thank you. See you all out on the water. I look forward to seeing everybody. Give us a wave.
Absolutely. And thanks again to Annapolis Yacht Sales for sponsoring this episode of Prop Talk Live. And we'll have another episode for you next Wednesday at 5 o'clock. So tune in then. But until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and get out on the water. Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye.